Good morning, Valley. I'm Janine, and like Barbara said, I'm the Executive Director of UU Jazz, which is the Unitarian Universalist Justice Arizona Network. At UU Jazz, we have 4 parts to our mission. We connect UUs across the state working for justice. We support justice ministries in congregations. We develop partnerships with grassroots organizations from around the state doing justice work that's in line with our values, and we work to sway public policy in the state of Arizona to be more in line with our UU beliefs. That last one's harder than it looks. I was really excited to be here with you today, and this morning, I did what I always do before I have to speak. I got nervous, and I started to rewrite my sermon. And this is the 10th time I've done this sermon, but it happens every time. It happens every time because there's always something, right? Every week holds some great injustice that we feel called to speak on. I wanted to talk about International Women's Day and how even though this is a day and a month celebrating women, our country is still not ready to have women in leadership at the same place that we put men. And I wanted to speak, thank you. And I wanted to speak about some wins we've had recently. Along with a coalition of 10 other organizations, UU Jazz was able to convince the Phoenix mayor and city council to implement civilian oversight of the Phoenix Police Department. Thank you. We went from the largest city in the country without any civilian oversight at all to the most progressive model in the country last week. And so every time I do this, I want to write a whole sermon based on what's going on recently, but then I get dressed and I put on my pin that I always wear when I preach, and it says, "Move at the speed of trust." It's a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, who our reading was by as well, and it reminds me that the most important first step whenever we organize together is to build relationship. Because there's nothing we can do if we're not all together. There's no way to build power with someone that you can't trust. And Brené Brown, who is another woman that I really admire, says that trust doesn't come from me coming up here and showing you my resume and telling you all the wonderful things I've done so that you'll trust me. And it definitely doesn't come from me coming up here and lecturing you about social justice. Trust comes from vulnerability. And so what I remind myself is that the first time I visit a congregation, the most important thing to do is to build that trust by being a little vulnerable with you. And my hope is that if I'm able to be a little vulnerable and speak about some of my journey, that you'll open yourselves up to building relationship with me too, to telling me about your journeys and letting me get to know you, so that we can be in community together and we can come from a place of trust as we build and work towards social justice. So with that in mind, I'd like to tell you a story. And it starts when I was born in Scottsdale, Arizona, to a white, Republican, wealthy, Catholic family. And we weren't Catholics with a small c, Christmas and Easter Catholics. We were big C Catholics. We were very involved in the church. My mother taught Sunday school from the time I was a kid. And when I was 10 years old, I started co-teaching classes with her. I was kind of a precocious kid. I actually wrote most of the curriculum, but don't tell my mom I told you. And I was so involved that by the time I was a teenager, I was voted Youth of the Year of the Phoenix Catholic Diocese. I know you're very impressed. Hold your applause for later. And what that meant was I got to serve Mass with the bishop at St. Simon and Jude's Cathedral downtown in Phoenix. That was the first time I was in a pulpit like this one. Needless to say, I liked it. And later that year, because I was a teenager, I started asking questions. She says, uh-oh. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we love when our kids ask questions, right? We encourage it. Keep questioning, kids. And in the Catholic community that I was in at the time, not so much. They didn't appreciate my questions. They didn't like that I started questioning about hell and God and sex, because teenagers ask questions about sex. They didn't like when I said that I didn't think my LGBTQ friends were doing anything wrong. And as the time came that I started asking these questions, two major events happened in my life. First, my mother, who was on the finance committee, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, and was keeping the books for the congregation or the church at the time, found that our priest was embezzling money from the church. And shortly thereafter, the bishop, who I had served Mass with, who offered to write my college recommendation letters, hit someone with his car and drove away. So there I was at 16 years old having a crisis of faith. All the leaders that I had been taught to look up to were not walking the talk that they had said. And I didn't know what to do. And so I talked to my parents. And at the time, I didn't like their answer, but now as a mother, I understand. It was reasonable. They said, Janine, we're not going to make you stay, but before you go, we'd like you to talk to Kathy, who was the director of religious education. She was a family friend and someone I trusted. And so I went in to talk to her, and I told her the doubts I was having and the hypocrisy that I was seeing between what we were preaching and what we were doing. And she said to me, Janine, you are a leader among the youth. You are a leader in this church, and if you leave, other kids will go with you, and their souls will be on your hands. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I had a similar reaction to you all. And so at 16 years old, I walked away from the church, and I was happily unchurched for many years until something changed in my life. Can you guess what it is? Yeah, my daughter Vivian was born. And she was sick. She was in the NICU. She was on a ventilator, struggling to breathe. And as a terrified new mother with no idea what to do, I turned to my partner and I said, do you think we should baptize her? And he said, Janine, we're atheists. And yes, that was true. Do you think we should do it anyway? And I didn't know at the time what I was looking for. I didn't know what was missing, and I knew that I didn't believe we needed to baptize her to cleanse her original sin, and I didn't think that if she didn't make it, she would go to hell. I didn't believe those things, but I was looking for something. I wanted a moment to mark how special this moment was, that the birth of this child was bigger than her tiny body. It was bigger than me and our family. It was something that belonged in community. It was something that was connected to spirit. And I didn't know what that looked like, but I knew I needed to find something because I knew I couldn't raise this child alone. None of us can do it alone. And I knew I needed to connect to something bigger. And I didn't know what that was until one night I was scrolling through Facebook, as you do sometimes as parents when your child's asleep, and I came upon a quiz. It said, what religion should you be? Now, I like to take quizzes on Facebook, but most of the time they're like, what Game of Thrones character are you? And this one was different. It was long. It had a lot of theological questions that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And the answer came back, Unitarian Universalist. And I said, what is that? And so I went to Google, and I was searching for, what this might mean, and I asked my partner at the time to take the quiz as well. Now, he had grown up without religion at all. In fact, he was very skeptical of organized religion, and he got the same result. Yeah. So shortly after that, in Denver, we went to check out a UU congregation, and after we moved to Phoenix shortly after, we stepped in the walls of a UU congregation for the first time, and you might say, I'm kind of a joiner because here I am today. Since then, I've done a lot of work trying to piece through some of the religious trauma that I had suffered. At first, I didn't like to hear any God language in a church. I was uncomfortable with the word prayer, and I certainly wasn't going to adopt a spiritual practice. But as I grew stronger in my Unitarian Universalist identity, I started to kind of experiment a little bit with what incorporating some of that ritual that I had grown up with might look like. And so I came upon a few different spiritual practices because my friend, Anthony Johnson, taught a class, and how he defined spiritual practice was anything you do that connects you to something bigger. Anything. And that something bigger can be anything it is for you, right? Spirit or earth-centered traditions or God. And the first thing that was suggested for me as a spiritual practice was nature practices, right? There's lots of UUs that really connect with nature, and it was suggested that I try hiking as a spiritual practice. So I tried it, and I can see how when your feet connect to the earth, when it's still and quiet and you can hear the sounds of nature all around you and not the city sounds that you're used to, and your mind gets still, how that can be a beautiful spiritual practice, and it helped me understand what that might mean. But as it turns out, I don't so much like to sweat, and so hiking was not the perfect fit for me. And Anthony told me that you can take a spiritual practice out of the closet, take it off the hanger, try it on, and if it's not the right fit, you can hang it back up, and it's probably going to work for someone else. So the first time I really experienced a spiritual practice that fit for me, it won't surprise some of you that I was at a protest. It was May Day, and I was downtown in Phoenix marching with Puente Human Rights Movement and some of our justice partners, and we were marching for workers' rights. And I was at the back of the line because I had a stroller with me, so I was with the other parents who, we walk slower, we have to keep stopping for snacks and, wiping kids' hands. And in fact, we were so far behind that the front of the line had turned the corner and we could barely hear the chants anymore. Now, someone in that moment handed me a megaphone. I don't know if you've ever held a megaphone before, but it is quite the spiritual practice, and not just because of the little bit of power that you get from it, but they asked me to start leading the chants. And at first I said, no, we leave that to folks most affected. They're doing that at the front of the line. It doesn't need to be me. But really, in this small group of just parents, there wasn't anyone else. That experience, leading a call and response with the people marching along with me, I felt connected. I felt connected to the movement. I felt connected to my friends around me. I felt connected to the greater movement that was happening throughout the country on that day. I felt connected to our ancestors, folks who marched for workers' rights, who ensured a 40-hour work week, the end to child labor, safe working practices for all of us. And I also felt connected to the future because our kids were there and they were learning how to make their voices heard too. Feeling that connection in that activity was when I first realized what some of my spiritual practices could look like. But as Barbara pointed out, activism doesn't mean anything if it's not accessible to all. And not everyone needs to chain themselves to the pipeline. There is a way for all of us to do activism. And for all of us, it's not marching. So I developed a second spiritual practice that I'd like to share with you. This one I started because I was thinking about my grandmother. And my grandmother would get up every morning. She'd make the coffee first, because that's the most important ritual in the morning, right? Spiritual practice of the coffee pot. And then she would sit down at her kitchen table, open the paper, read the paper, and then she would get out her rosary. I'm not going to ask you to say the rosary. I see some of your faces. That's not where this is going. But she had something physical and tangible that she did every day. She set intentional time to do. It was the same every day, but she took that moment to connect to her values and to connect to what was happening in the world and to see a connection between those two. Now, I was at General Assembly this summer, and I went to the youth worship. If you ever go to GA, go to the youth worship. It's one of the most amazing things at General Assembly, and they won't point it out to you because it's kind of, undercover, but you can sneak in the back and watch. And the youth, most of whom had not grown up with the religious trauma that I did, that some of you may have had, aren't as afraid about embracing religious practices, and they had built an altar. Now, 5 years ago, I never would have thought I'd be standing up here telling you that I have an altar in my home. But I saw the way the youth had done this, and I started thinking about what that could look like for me. And so in my house, there's a square tray. It's our altar space. And everyone in my family is invited to put anything on it that makes them feel connected to something bigger. For my kids, sometimes it's that special rock that you find in the park or on the beach. That's that really important special rock that you need to save. Or flowers, things they find outside. Sometimes it's that little slip of fortune cookie that really speaks to you that day that goes on the altar. I have photos of my grandmother and pieces of poetry and readings from people that inspire me. I do have a candle on my altar. It's a Divina candle, Our Lady of Guadalupe, but the face is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Anything that connects you to something bigger, right? And every morning, I take my kids to school, and when I come back home and I have a minute to myself, I bring out my altar, I light the candle, and I think about my values. I think about what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist, what my values call me to do. And then I pick up my phone, which you'll see has a sticker that says, "This is my spiritual practice," because the next thing I do is fill out that petition, call my senator or mayor or city council member or representative, or get on request to speak, and I make my voice heard. I talk about my UU values and how they call me to do justice work. And it's real short, 3 to 5 minutes, because I think it's important to have that intentional time, but to keep that time short, because otherwise we get overwhelmed, right? And that's not an accident. It's not an accident that injustices are coming at us from all sides, from women's rights to reproductive rights, to LGBTQ rights and trans rights, for climate justice and racial justice. It's at all sides, and that's on purpose. It's because people in power want you to feel small. They want you to feel like you can't make a difference. What's your one voice going to do? But I'm here to tell you it makes a difference, because when I call my representative, Greg Stanton's office, I talk to his receptionist, Becca, because this is what happens when you call every day. You get to know people. And you know what Becca tells me? She says that whatever issue I'm calling about, I'm in the minority. There are more people calling against immigration justice than when I call. And that's because they're better organized, right? But when I call, I want to be that tally mark on the side of justice. I want to be that tally mark on the side of love. I want to be that tally mark that says our UU values are so important that we are compelled to make our voices heard. And it's something I can do, because if I do it every day, it builds my muscle for justice. It lets me know that I can make a difference. I'm here to tell you all that our UU values are world-changing if you're only brave enough to speak them out into the world. Thank you.